let's get this one over with. Another game that was released after I started writing this video. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Alex Kidd, it was Sega's biggest franchise on the Sega Master System, at least according to VG charts. So remaking this game doesn't seem like that unrealistic of an idea. So if this game does hold up, it should be a great way to introduce new players to the franchise. Since I had purchased this game physically, it ended up being more expensive since it comes with a keychain and a black and white instruction book in order to replicate the Master System. The cartridge is even the red and black look, and the game has a reversible cover that looks like the original horrible graph paper cover, which is a really nice touch that I think adds a lot to the experience. Now, as far as the actual game goes, it's a fairly standard platform at the time. You jump around, punch blocks, and die every second due to unfair enemy placements. Yeah, this is a certified 1980s 2D platformer. At some point, game developers decided that it was a better idea to, instead of designing good levels, to make the level as hard as possible to artificially increase playtime. I'm aware that people like these kinds of games, but I'm personally not too fond of them. Now, thankfully, you can enable an infinite lives option to make the game actually playable, which I do appreciate. Now, the remake obviously redoes all the visuals to make them more modernized and nice. Every level has a lot more detail, and the game looks really good for being a Switch game. They even added new weather effects and details to certain levels just to add more visual variety to the game overall, which is a really good touch. Now, I will say the redesign for Alex Kidd does look awfully familiar. One fun aspect of the remake is that they allow you to choose the different food options when you have a region, so that the food you grab at the end of the level can be whichever one you want.
Being British, I was really concerned about the fact that I wasn't going to be able to connect to this game on an intimate level and get invested in its universe, but now I've seen it's got fish and chips, that's not going to be a problem. Let's go.
The biggest feature that the game offers is that with the hit of a button, you can switch back to the old graphics in order to experience the original version. Although you can just buy the original Alex Kidd for $8 on the Switch, so this feels a bit pointless in the grand scheme of things. Now, unfortunately, a byproduct of this classic mode is that the game is a tile-for-tile remake, which in my opinion is the worst kind of remake. Since when you remake a game, the expectation is that you take the original game and update it to modern standards. But for some games, in order to make the process easier, or laziness I guess, they just take the original and rebuild the entire game with the exact same layout. The problems I have with these types of remakes are, 1. The old layout will almost always clash with the new art style and look really dated. It could be very distracting to the player. And then 2. If the remake is worse in any way, then it defeats the entire point of remaking the game in the first place if you aren't going to properly update it for modern times. And with a game like Alex Kidd, which is from 1986, the level design is more often than not going to not exactly age the best. This game really showcases this problem with the blocks. There are a lot of blocks. Now, this is easy to forgive in 1986, but nowadays there is much more to be expected of video games than to have blocky platformers. A good platformer has more dynamic shapes that feel more like a natural area rather than just a bunch of blocks in the world. Take Super Mario World, where sure there's still blocks, but there's also slopes, moving platforms, and obstacles that make the level feel more like it's in a natural area full of hills, cliffs, and various obstacles put in place by Bowser. In Alex Kidd, however, most levels are very flat, with several square platforms that you must punch through in order to defeat one enemy or get a few coins out of it. When the average Mario Maker level has more going for it than your $30 game, that's not really a good sign. What I'm trying to say is a game like Alex Kidd could have been given better treatment by designing new and dynamic levels based on the original game, which there clearly was some intention to, seeing as they designed beautiful new backgrounds and level themes for the game. If anything, the remake graphics makes the decision even more confusing, since the original graphics at least match the game. In the remake, it really looks like a bad custom level for an Alex Kidd fan game more than anything. The straight line levels are also extremely dull. There is really no variety in the gameplay at all for most of the game. You just go right, and go right, and go right. It gets old extremely quickly. That's probably honestly why the game is so hard. They needed some way to make the game memorable. To the game's credit, there are 2 castle levels in the game, which are actually quite fun. They use a non-linear approach, and you have to go through a maze of sorts to reach the boss. As fun as these are, they are really short-lived when compared to the rest of the experience. Anyway, on the topic of controls, at first I found the controls to be too slippery and the hitboxes to be extremely unforgiving.
How could this happen?
I don't know, maybe those giant ears he has keep scraping the enemies. Thankfully, if you go to the options menu, there is a new control option that makes the game much smoother and forgiving, with hitboxes that aren't utter trash. I appreciate the effort made to have an option for better controls, but that should have been the original option for controls rather than sticking with the unforgiving settings that are akin to the original game. That would be like if they remade a game known for having extremely precise controls, only to make it feel like a trackball instead, which they obviously wouldn't do. I understand that this was done in part because some areas aren't accessible with the improved controls, but this really shows why making a tile-for-tile remake is more trouble than it's worth. I think the biggest example of what I'm talking about is Jenkins Castle, one of the final levels of the game and the worst offender when it comes to bad level design. You're playing the fortress, it's actually pretty fun until you reach this room. Seriously? A small room full of tightly confined spike blocks? And this is the water room, meaning you constantly float upwards and you need to press down to lower. How am I intended to dodge this? So naturally, I begin to try to precisely weave through this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle NES style bullshit. Maybe it won't be too bad? This room is ungodly. I can't believe actual programmers made this. This entire game, this entire level up to this point. Sure, the level design wasn't good, but at least it was fair. I will never forgive whoever made this abomination. Oh, wait a minute. You don't die if you hit the bottom of the spikes as long as you don't press up? Why? I do appreciate that the room is actually playable, but the block shows spikes on both sides, so the player is going to assume that both are bad. That might be the single worst game design I've ever seen in a video game. They could have at least changed how the blocks look in the modern mode. We're 55 minutes in, let's just move on. One aspect of the game that's worth mentioning is the shop system. At the start of certain levels, you will see a building that you can enter which has free items you can buy in order to make the game slightly easier to play. You get the money by breaking the gold blocks in the levels. This adds some risk since you're much more likely to get killed several times trying to grab money. And if you game over at any point, you'll lose all of the money you've acquired. So you have to be very careful, otherwise you'll end up being very frustrated trying to accrue money. The items you can get from the shop range in usefulness, with the power bracelet allowing you to shoot fireballs in order to increase your punch range. And on the other half of the spectrum, there is a car, which allows you to speed through enemies and the level. This all is going to be easy. Alright, I'm done. Yeah, if you hit anything, the car will instantly explode and you realize that the car is actually a scam. Every time I bought the car, I immediately crashed. Maybe it would be easy to use if the game had, I don't know, a single slope. If you want to avoid the shop and make the game shorter, there is another way to get the power bracelet specifically, being the question mark blocks that are scattered around the levels. These are interesting since they are a test of luck, since there are 3 possible things you can get out of these. The bracelet, an extra life, and the ghost enemy, which will chase you down and instantly kill you unless you scroll the screen past them. Finding these is pretty much an instant death sentence, but the blocks are actually not random since they're in a set order. But the first block is different based on the level, so once you figure out what the first spawn is, then you can perfectly predict what's in the blocks and utilize them to your advantage. I like the risk and reward of these, and it is much more interesting than a Mario block that just gives you a mushroom every time. That being said, there is something to be said about just how many things in this game exist just to randomly kill the player. The last part of this game I discussed is the rock, paper, scissors mechanic. At the end of some levels, you have to fight off a hand enemy in an extreme, fight to the death, no is held, life-changing rock, paper, scissors game. I find this part all to be really annoying personally. Like, sure, it adds charm to the gameplay experience that you have to do something this goofy at the end of the level, but at the same time that means you can get through a whole level and whether or not you pass can come down to pure luck. There was more than one occasion where I had 1 life left getting to this point and I had to restart the whole level because I guessed wrong. And that in itself feels unfair to the player. Like, why? Is the game not hard enough? You literally just had to add a 1 in 3 chance at the very end. Thankfully, to the game's credit, the actual moves the enemy makes aren't randoms, so once you lose once, you can remember what they played and beat them instantly. There is an item to see what moves they'll make in order to avoid this, but I still hate that there is the mechanic that is inherently luck-based that is required for progression in a game that already feels so artificially difficult. In conclusion, I'm sort of torn on this game. The remake clearly has a lot of passion put into it. Everything is animated beautifully, and with the settings turned on, it controls much better. And they put in a lot of effort to update this game as much as they could. I don't blame the developers at all for how this remake turned out. To be honest, this game was pretty much doomed from the start. The problem is, by making a game that is a literal tile per tile remake, you keep every single issue that the original game has. All it really does is show just how outdated the original game was, and really just makes me wish that they either remade it from the ground up or made another sequel instead. Alex Kidd just really isn't a unique enough franchise to get a game like this. If you're in the market for a retro pixel art styled platformer on the Switch, then there are numerous examples of games that do that way better than this game does. Alex Kidd just isn't a household name for a lot of people, so at the end of the day, this game just feels like another generic platformer on the Switch.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class D license. I can't believe it. Was that your best? I don't think so.